Welcome into the Living Room Disciple podcast. Christmas is quickly approaching and Phil is enjoying some well-deserved family time this week, so today I'm thrilled to have friend of the podcast, Jared Stacy, joining me as a guest co-host to have a conversation about the ways that we are formed by our American Christmas celebrations. See, Advent and Christmas are seasons of both awaiting and then celebrating the birth of our Messiah. But if we're honest, this is often a time of year that shapes us to look more like Americans, not more like Jesus. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode of the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home. So today is a special episode of the Living Room Disciple, not just because it is a Christmas episode and we are decked out in Christmas gear. Yes, and Jared, show off the mug. I've got Buddy the Elf here.
Right here.
We've got Mickey Mouse with a Santa hat. That's right. It's a special Christmas episode, and if you're listening, you have no idea what's going on, but YouTube just got a special treat. But I am here with Jared Stacy, who has graciously agreed to join me as a guest co-host today. Phil is out of commission for the week, so Jared is here with us.
Big shoes to fill.
Exactly right. Big shoes to fill. Nice.
Yes. This is the kind of podcast I am proud to be co-hosting in a pinch-hitting situation. There we go.
I love it. So good. So if you have not heard of Jared before, we actually had him on a previous episode to talk about conspiracy theories. Jared is living in Scotland with his family, studying, working on a PhD, studying conspiracy theories in evangelicalism specifically. But today we're not really going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Christmas. Because Jared also he grew up in America, was a pastor in the United States before he went to Scotland. And so I wanted to pick his brain, both because I know he'll have a lot of incredible thoughts for us, but also because he's experienced Christmas in a totally different culture. So I'm excited to hear from him today about American Christmas. So we want to ask the question, how are we formed by Christmas? Because when you read, even starting with the Torah, it is clear that the God we follow thinks that holidays are formational, right? He institutes these feasts and celebrations and holy days for Israel to follow as he forms them to be a chosen possession, his special people, his kingdom of priests. He wants to form them with the Torah, and one of the ways he does that is by setting up special days to celebrate. And so we are formed by the things that we celebrate. We are formed by our calendars. We are formed by the seasons of life we participate in. And today we want to talk about the way that God would intend for us to be formed as we celebrate his birth, but also the ways that we are maybe unintentionally formed by the ways that we do celebrate it in the United States. So, Jared, what comes to mind for you? Let's start with the positive. What are some positive ways that we are formed by the ways that we celebrate Christmas?
Oh man, that's a whole question. We could spend all our time on that. I mean, I think part of that is learning how to narrate that question. There's a lot of ways that we're formed viscerally, that subconsciously, that we don't know how to articulate. And so I think it's helpful to have these kind of conversations where we're actually consciously thinking about it. So the obvious, maybe to start there, is that we all kind of experience a conversion every October, November. I mean, we expect it. Our Starbucks coffee cups turn from white to red. Suddenly the commercials that we're watching in between NFL or NBA games have sleigh bells, and so there's this consumer conversion that we anticipate, all kind of in some ways look forward to, or it's signals that it's that time. So I think that's the obvious. And then everyone also we all take part in that. If you use media in any way, shape, or form, and you go into brick or mortar stores, you see that, if not participate in it. And then there's family traditions, family formative events that are so unique and different for every family and have meaning that's coded inside a family and those relationships that can't be duplicated, but they can also be expanded. I think that's the other exciting thing is, I'm married, and so there's a fusion of families, and You don't have to have a family to experience this, right? Because we can get here, but the church is not just an expansion of family, but it's an inclusion of all these different histories together. And when you even look at the church, I'm running with this, but I'll just land here real quickly. Say even when you look at the church gathered around the body of Jesus is also expanding and concentrating Israel's own history in that Jewish body. And so that's me kind of riffing off of Willie James and his kind of commentary on it. But yeah, I think there's a couple dimensions there. Our families have their own traditions that form us. Our participation in the season, quote unquote, and all the different practices that are bound up in there. So I guess this kind of makes me pivot and want to ask, what are some O'Brien family Christmas traditions that wouldn't be Christmas without this?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that come to mind for me are, the classic waking up and you come out and you start with the Santa gifts, the big gifts, and then move on to the rest of the presents. And we finish with stockings. And then we have a big cinnamon roll breakfast. And so, and just, kind of the joy of the morning, the magic of the morning. You wake up and something is different. Like you said, it's almost a conversion where something happens overnight between Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. The air feels different. The ambiance feels different. Something is different in the air, which I think can be a signpost, a pointer to what happened on that first Christmas, right? Something changed, whether it was perceivable or not. This tiny little thing in a small town, in one little section of the world, but everything changed because of it. And so I think we can get a sense of that. Another one that I love, this one actually hits on what you said about joining a family and having this fusion of traditions. So my wife, her family would get tacos on Christmas Eve after Christmas Eve service. And so we've adopted that. She's moved to where my family lives. And so we've adopted that. So she still has a taste of her family Christmas here. And I think there's something beautiful about that as well, that we can all bring our kind of traditions together and we can learn from one another. And it's a picture of the church, the inclusion of family, that what my family does is not necessarily right. What your family does is not necessarily wrong. It's this classic us versus them dynamic, right? But when we can learn from one another and so there are myriad ways. There's going to be some criticisms of American Christmas in this episode, but there are also myriad ways that Christmas is, the way we celebrate it, is helpful and formative. The generosity of the season, the joy of the season. There's so many different things that actually allow us to embody the gospel during this time of year. But there are also some negative things. So let me push that question back to you. What are some ways that you celebrate? And I'm interested to hear, how is Christmas different for the Stacy family in Scotland versus in the United States?
Yeah, so I growing up, actually, there was a lot of similarity. We don't maybe have the time to draw this out, but I wonder how much of the expectations of and the traditions of what constitute a Christmas Eve or a Christmas morning are, in some ways reflected in, resolved by the movies that we watch, the stories that we consume. So if we were to draw this back far enough in history, I think a lot of what we would call just Christmas in terms of tradition and expectation and all those things comes from Charles Dickens. I mean, the idea of Christmas spirit, all of that goes down to there. Now, you asked me about my own family. I mean, we were bringing, for us, it was going over to my grandmother's on Christmas Eve, and she always had Pizza Hut pizza, and my wife's family does take out Chinese. And we've brought those kind of traditions together, and we do the cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning, just like you guys.
Awesome.
So yeah, like there's similarity, but then there's also the fact that as you get older and people pass, families grow apart geographically, that all that changes, but it changes in a way where you try to negotiate it in order to retain and expand
Hmm.
those traditions. So, I mean, for us here, for your listeners who kind of don't know kind of our story, you mentioned it, but we've been here in Scotland for 3 years. This will be our third Christmas here. We went back to the States last year for Christmas, but we flew
Okay.
the day after Christmas. So we did Christmas Eve here last year. So this is what I would describe it though. I mean, Christmas in the UK, and this is where Dickens lived. So
Yeah.
it's
Right.
still what we're talking about. The difference between the UK Christmas and Christmas in America kind of reflects how Christianity exists in both of these cultures or countries. And the
Fascinating.
way that I've described Christianity and its influence here in the UK, it's different than the US. The US is sort of saturated with Christianity in the topsoil, like
Hmm.
Chick-fil-A, especially the Bible Belt. Like there's vestiges of that here in Scotland, right? Where north, like the Highlands, is almost kind of like a Bible Belt. And if you go back far enough in time, like that's where it was here in the UK. But the main difference with the UK is that it's not saturated on the surface culturally anymore. But it's bedrock. And so historians like Tom Holland and their works
Hmm.
Dominion, like these are all really accessible stuff. And this is just a conversation that people are having about how Christianity has shaped the West, and for
Hmm.
good and for bad. And so
Hmm.
it's more like saturated on the surface of America, where the topsoil is kind of just wet. You can actually see like, oh, like this is kind of a
Yeah.
very overt Christian, like
Hmm.
that's there. But here in the UK, people still go to the Christmas Eve services. People kind of still do you hear the caroling, you kind of, and it's all that kind of bound up in what it is to be British, and part of what that British identity was attached to being Christian. Like it's still there. It's still recognizable. Even, and this is where I'll kind of land it in a very concrete practice. Like one of the things that is, recently changed is that the schools until very recently were still doing nativities, like state schools were still doing nativity
Interesting.
plays, very much like Peanuts Christmas, right? In America.
Yeah.
Like, so, but that's not happening anymore. And we were talking to some of our friends who just kind of said in passing, they're our age, and just kind of said, oh, we miss that. We miss
Hmm.
the nativity. And, most people here are not, if they say they're Christian, they mean it. There's no such thing really as a cultural
Right.
Christian. So
Right.
that category is kind of gone, but people find themselves kind of caught up in that. So what I'm saying is that there's not a huge difference. But what the difference is America's always just making things bigger, flashier, more
Right.
pronounced. And that's part of, I think, that aspect of just America. So yeah, was that clear? Was that muddy? I'm trying
Yeah.
to. We felt very at home, very
Yeah.
normal. We don't where we
Right.
really feel out of place is Thanksgiving, but we're not talking about Thanksgiving. We're talking about Christmas.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so a lot of traditions from America, Starbucks. I mean, it's all imported and it's all
Right.
exported, and it's all very,
Right.
actually pretty similar. So the difference that I'm trying to talk about is how Christianity has operated differently in these cultures and respective countries.
Yeah. I'm interested in the difference in the level of consumerism, the way that we turn Christmas
Yeah,
into a marketing opportunity. Does that happen at the same level in Scotland?
yeah. So what's interesting is one of the markers each year. It's a really big deal. There's a department store. I guess probably the closest thing to it, called M&S or MS. Um, and they put out an advert or a commercial every year around November, and it is kind of a kind of
Yeah.
a high watermark culturally of like, what is M&S doing with their Christmas ad? Kind of like if
Interesting.
there's like 90s kids listening to this, remember the Hess trucks, like that was
Yeah.
always a big deal. What's Hess doing this year? Well, it's kind of similar culturally, where what's the line they're taking? How are they kind of selling or interpreting the Christmas spirit? And this year, the ad provoked a lot of really interesting conversation around like evangelicals and Christians that I'm kind of in touch
Hmm.
with, and kind of listen to their cultural commentary, because I'm just here to learn and listen. And the ad, you can go and watch it. It has various celebrities who are known in Britain, and who who are kind of just saying, I'm exhausted by all of the, crafts and all the presentation, and I'm exhausted by the tradition. I want to focus more like on the existential, like, all the tasks, but let's just throw all that out. Let's focus on the spirit. Let's focus on just being together. And so that's kind of the pivot that they took, was like taking all of the decorations and kind of just saying like, hey, forget all that. Let's focus on being with each other. Which is like the Christmas Carol. It's like Dickens. It's we're not saying anything unique when we say, oh man, like we're formed by consumerism and materialism and the capitalism that lurks behind it. We're not saying anything new. Like even stories that come out and adverts that come out that are clearly trying to sell us stuff, right? They're still saying, hey, like
story. Yeah.
We understand Christmas and it's not about this, but we have some really good stuff on sale. Like it's still, it's not really resolving anything, but it's kind of giving permission for people to feel like I can go about my business and be formed in these ways. But, at the end of the day, I'm remembering what the reason for the season is, and it's not about these things. It's all very contradictory. It's all very contradictory because the logic is still there, but what they're selling is kind of that inverted feeling of, oh, it's not about this. And so it's contradictory, and I think conversations like these are just really helpful to narrate, like, what does a Christian presence in the world, with the world, look like when Christmas is probably the only time of year where you can walk into Target and hear some really good incarnational Christology if Hark the Angel, Herald Angels Sing happens to come on. Like the Christology of that song is amazing, and you can hear it anywhere if you're just listening. So how do we live in that world? So let me ask you, I mean, you've lived in Florida for a few years now. This doesn't need to necessarily be a politically angled question, but I know what isn't here in the UK that I know is in the States more pronounced is that idea of like war on Christmas. It's kind of like the way that taking American back for God does turn from the white Starbucks cup to the red cup, and it's like, okay, this is what culture war Christmas looks like. And that becomes a very key part of like that identity. And there's some maybe reactionary resentment bound up in kind of not living Jesus as the reason for the season, but making sure people know, like eliciting a confrontation. So I'm kind of asking, is that kind of discourse, is that kind of conversation, is that kind of, reactionary culture war Christmas? Do you notice that more in where you're at?
Yeah, I definitely have seen that. And I think it starts with a failed assumption when you read the New Testament. I mean, Paul is pretty clear about we are to judge those inside of our church body, but we are not to judge those outside. And I think what we have done is we've just assumed that Christmas is something that everybody needs to celebrate, and they need to do it from a Christian perspective, whether they call themselves Christians or not. And so we judge people that are not inside our church body, inside the body of Christ, for not living like they're in the body of Christ when they never asked to be in the body of Christ in the first place. And so I think we need to be more about paying attention to our own business and making sure that those within the church are not celebrating Christmas in a way that contradicts the gospel, right? We were talking before we started about the heart of Christmas is that a God who was enthroned in glory, who had the cattle on 1,000 hills, who has everything, who created everything, chose to limit himself to human flesh, and not just to human flesh, but to infancy, to growing in a single woman, not a single woman, but a woman's womb, right?
Yeah.
And he chose to limit his divinity. Of course, he's fully God, but to put boundaries on that divinity by taking on human flesh and being born in a humble manger with no room in the inn, right? And then we take that holiday and we turn it into excess and abundance and flashiness and advertisements and big and loud. And how often do our lives betray the meaning of the first Christmas because we want to participate in this Americanized Christmas that's more shaped by advertisers than it is by Luke 2, right?
Yeah.
How often are are we participating in that? But then we're angry at people who aren't even Christians for not making it about Jesus.
So I'm gonna ask you a question, and I know you have teed this up great, and I think that probably resonates with so many, right? Who recognize, like, where are God's people supposed to direct our attention, and our action? Like, what is coordinating our action for the world, in the world? And so it kind of brings up this question. And the other dynamic that you raised is the distinction between Advent and Christmas, right? That Christmas can be about abundance, can be about God with us, and all of the abundant. But what does that abundance look like?
Joy to the world, the Lord is come.
Right. That's the second. Like, how does that affect our? So there's that. But then there's also Advent, and to make a recommendation. I mean, if that kind of hits with you, you're like, oh man, what is the difference between? I came from the lowest of low church context, and that's not a dig. That's just kind of an example of that's just my story. So learning about these liturgical processes where there are those who would say, like, let's pump the brakes on joy to the world. We need to sit in darkness, like Isaiah talks about, before we can say we've seen a great light. We need to sit with that. And there are churches here that I think practice that really well. And I know there are churches in the US, but this is my question, because we talked about, like, the war on Christmas, and kind of a evangelical as a political label, and saying, okay, we need to coercively install Christianity, and that means that if I hear someone say Happy Holidays, I'm gonna be a jerk. So here's my question. And I don't mean this critically as much as I mean it constructively, and as someone who is a pastor. So I should probably preface that with, when I was a pastor, I led the Christmas Eve effort. And so we're talking about services with 3 services, 800 people a service. So you're looking at a massive, massive undertaking that took months to prepare. And there wasn't really anything flashy about it. And it was a very tailored down kind of Kevin Home Alone Christmas Eve candlelight service, right? And it's something that even people who wouldn't count themselves as Christians would come and attend, and that's all helpful and good. But I'm I'm not alone in recognizing that's not always the norm for churches, and the churches in America do have full-on productions and all of these things, and put a massive amount of resources. So I don't want to lump every church in their own context into one bucket and kind of raise all this contempt. But the conversation needs to be had of how does the church's practices around Christmas time sort of reinforce rather than resist, and kind of, so that I'm kind of throwing that out there. Like, where do you see the church's responsibility to gather and to be together and to celebrate Christmas? There's maybe that tension between resisting and reinforcing. And so what are some things that you feel like the church may need to pivot in towards resisting on the one hand, in terms of practices? And it's exhausting being a pastor during the holidays. And I always lived with that tension of how much of this is me capitulating to cultural demands, and how much of this is me reinforcing God's people and saying, this is what it's about. And I've always lived in that. I never got it right. But there's a whole lot of tension there. So you're in that world, you're closer to that reality, and some of our listeners are. And so I want to sit back and just kind of listen to you kind of articulate and narrate that for us. And I think that would be really helpful. Like, how do you see the church in America kind of, and I'll repeat my question, how do you see the church in America needing to reinforce certain things about how we gather, how often services, things like that? And what do you feel like in other ways it needs to pivot to resist? Knowing that every church is going to make their own decision in their own context, in their own communities, traditions, all of that stuff still on the table. But having a general conversation, I think, can raise the need of, hey, are we moving so fast that we can't even have the conversation? That's my concern. Right. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I love the vantage point of how do we resist this kind of cultural Christmas. And by cultural Christmas, I don't mean happy holidays. I mean Christians who are sold out for Christ, living lives that are less generous and more about abundance for self. So I love the posture of resistance. I think that there's something I think that there's something beautiful about the Christmas Eve service that you described, just kind of low and candlelight and
Right.
soft and gentle and silent night, right? Our church does I'm actually the worship pastor at our church, and we do have a pretty big.
My ears. I really want to hear what Nick has to say about this.
Yep. Our church does a pretty big. I wouldn't say production. It's not like there's not like moving lights and fog and that kind of deal, but
it's a sliding scale.
But it's a very celebratory service, is what I should say. And I think there's something to kind of culminating Advent in celebration of the fullness of your anticipation. Like you've been anticipating for several weeks, and you get to that Christmas Eve, the night before the birth, and your anticipation is just bursting at the seams. Like, when is it coming? When is it coming? When is it coming? And then it breaks forth as you're gathered together as the church in this celebration of joy to the world. The Lord is coming tomorrow morning. But I think what we do too often is, as soon as Thanksgiving is over, the church is not very good at living in grief and lament. And the same thing is true of Holy Week and even of Lent, where we don't do a very good job of Good Friday. We might celebrate it just on that day, but we don't do a great job of living in the reality of the cross. We don't do a very good job of living in the reality of life before the Messiah. We want to jump right to victory and celebration, and I think a lot of that is rooted in the seeker-sensitive movements of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s that wanted to say, hey, come to our church because you're going to be filled with joy and you're going to feel nothing but happiness, and there's nothing bad that's ever going to happen. The problem is that ignores the reality that most of the people walking into the doors of the church they have something heavy weighing on their heart. And if we just ignore that and jump right to celebration, we're ignoring the heart of the gospel, that Jesus came for the weak and the lowly. Blessed are the poor in spirit, right? And I think the upside down nature of the gospel and the upside down nature of our Savior coming as a baby to be born in a manger with no room in the inn, I think the upside down nature of the kingdom of God tells us that we need to have room to live in grief when the world says skip right over that, just self-care, treat yourself. We need to say, no, we're going to live in the silence. We're going to live in the darkness. We're going to live in the hardship, knowing that a light is coming and rejoicing that a light is coming, having our hope firmly rooted in the light that is coming, but being aware that we need to sit with our grief and see. I heard a quote from, do you know the author Bob Goff?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I heard a great quote from him on a podcast. He said, when you hit rock bottom, turn your light on and look around to see what you're going to learn about yourself while you're down there. And I thought that was so helpful. Like, sit in the darkness and see what God is going to tell you in that suffering, right? It's the book of James. It's the book of Romans. Blessed are you when you suffer, because you will find perseverance and character. And in that character and perseverance, you'll find your hope. And so I think we need to learn to sit in Advent, to sit in Lent during the spring, and not skip straight to the birth, not skip straight to the resurrection. So what does that look like? What does that look like for you? What are some practices?
Well, could I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yes, please do.
So I'm making an assumption that there might be church leaders, pastors, who's, in a similar sense, and right, people who maybe lead small groups. Maybe you have something that you're responsible for during the holidays and during Christmas, and there's always this sense, at least how I remember it, in those spaces, kind of peeling back the curtain a little bit, where a lot of the there's a lot of pressure, or there's a lot of awareness, maybe is a less critical way to put it, that more people will be attentive and attuning to church gatherings.
Right.
And so around Christmas, within Christian organizations, within churches, there's a lot of, I experience, for good and for bad, just a lot, these logics of saying we have to leverage Christmas. We have to make sure that we're retaining the people. And if you're new to church and walking in here, I'm not trying to turn anyone into a cynic. I'm speaking as a pastor who was in these spaces and who is now just kind of saying, okay, we should be free to talk about these logics that we spiritualize, and learn how to narrate and articulate why we do what we do, and think about the thoughts that we're assuming. So what I'm asking, as the follow-up question to that is, how do you think the church's responsibility to sit in Advent might also implicate these, greasing the wheels? We gotta go into the new year with a big blow. We want to make sure we retain people who from our neighborhood who come.
Right.
Like, do you think that there's a divestment and a dispossession that needs to happen? And that's a leading question, but I'm just curious, like, what would happen if we started to take that seriously in how the church articulates and narrates its own vision for Christmas services and creatives and things like that? Because I guess that's my point. M&S and Target, no one's out here selling Advent. They're selling the abundance of Christmas.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Right? So I'm all good for those kind of celebratory services. So I'm asking, like, okay, where does the logic of that meet the church where it's at? So that's a loaded leading question. No bones about it. But I think the conversation's helpful.
Yep, it is. I hope this doesn't sound too harsh, but I would just ask, what opportunity did Jesus leverage? When did he see a crowd and say, I need to keep building on this momentum? When did Jesus ever do that in the Gospels? Whereas Paul, I think it's in Romans 6, says that sin seizes the opportunity. And I think there is a darkness to our need for efficiency and momentum and numbers, and that betrays the, again, upside down nature of the kingdom of God. Where Jesus time and time again seems to do the exact opposite thing that he should do. And I think the church and Christians as individuals need to get better at being willing to just do the right thing, even if it's not pragmatic. We need to do the Jesus-centered, Spirit-filled thing, and the thing that the church has been doing for 1,000 years, right? Over doing the pragmatic thing that we're living in an age where we have all these self-help books and leadership books and ideas and ideologies that move us towards, here's how to grow the next mega brand, or here's how to become an influencer, or here's how to have the biggest church. So we're living, this is the water we're swimming in, is how to get bigger, better.
That's the logic that is driving it. And it gets spiritualized, it gets Christianized in all sorts of ways that in the immediate sense just seems to give it some plausibility.
For sure. But it also is a denial of faith in a God that can actually work in the small and unseen. It's a denial in the God of the mustard seed that gets planted and becomes the big tree because you planted the tiniest seed. It's a denial of a God who, rather than continuing to expand himself, again, became a human, like embodied himself in a 8-pound infant, right? And I think there's something to saying, we're not going to do the thing that would make sense if we were a corporation to grow our numbers. We're not going to do that thing. We're going to do the thing that is uniquely done by the church. And when we do that, we might not see any results, but we also trust God that when we do the right thing, the Spirit-filled thing, the Jesus-centered thing, that God is actually real, God is living, God is active, God is with us. And whether we have results or not, that's what it's all about, right? When we put our hope in pragmatism, we're putting hope in our own intellect and our own plans and our own strategies, rather than placing our faith in God, that it could very well be that doing the small thing is actually going to be the mustard seed in the ground that allows that becomes the flourishing tree for all the birds to nest in.
Yeah, I mean,
so what is it?
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask you, what does it look like for you to start to live into the resistance that you mentioned earlier? What are some things that we can do to resist the consumerism, to resist the need to skip the grief and the darkness?
Yeah.
What are some resistance strategies for Christians and for churches?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the first thing for me is I was is building kind of an inner life that gets attuned to that around this season. There's I think we're all kind of we haven't talked about this yet, but we're all kind of breathing the air of individualism, and probably one thing that we all need to hear all the time is that it's not on us, and that we as the
Yeah.
church are a community, and that means specifically for me there are so many good Advent theologies. I mean,
Yeah.
reflections that are taking the voices across the ages for the church and delivering them. And I think that kind of building an inner life where it's communal and participatory with people who have wrote and thought about Advent from and for the church. So to give some
Hmm.
examples, there's a collection of essays from Bonhoeffer called "God is in the Manger." Fleming
Mm.
Rutledge has an incredible
Yeah.
theological kind of treatment of Advent, and everything is just very, very palatable. It's these are academics, but theology done well, especially during Christmas, is a theology that is just articulating God in all of his weakness is here for us.
Mm.
And so there is a building that inner life that these voices are kind of given free reign to frame uh, my own consciousness going about my day, because the Christmas season is busy. I there's no I'm kind of glad the conversation hasn't gone in that direction. Like I'm yes, we live in an efficiency obsessed busyness is a value and a virtue kind of culture, and that's different here. It's not so much here. We don't breathe that air in the UK as much. But I
Hmm.
think cultivating the inner life is one practice of resistance. I think, in a very practical sense, knowing that there's such a demand on our schedules and time, um, to recognize that the Christmas season and Advent, um, keep your schedule and your calendar close and keep control of it, heightened control, where you're planning to be spontaneous, where you're planning
Yeah.
time and margin to make sure that you are. So that's important for us. I think that's something that we've learned.
Hmm.
Um, I think the second thing too, is finding those opportunities where it's not you're not finding something to consume, but to contribute. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so that to kind of draw that out. I mean, that can be um, volunteering. That can be participating in your church. That can be contributing to a gathering of friends. Like the whole idea of running the Christmas party docket doesn't have to be um, doesn't have to be framed in terms of like, well, I'm consuming all these parties. It can be like contributing to environments where
Right.
hospitality
Right.
is the name and is the logic and is the thing that we're doing. So yeah, like there's
And
a
we
whole bunch
can
of
use
things.
consuming to contribute. We can use
Yeah, it's
consuming to
like
contribute by shopping with small businesses and supporting
yeah.
local
There's
people. And,
a whole host, I think, of practices that I think probably as I'm kind of narrating this and bringing those three things together, I'm almost kind of landing for myself and saying,
hmm,
I think it's just really important to have the conversation. It's like really important to ask ourselves this question of like, how is Christmas forming me this year? What is the distinction between
hmm,
Advent and Christmas?
yeah.
And what am I, because Christmas, the season is always kind of always carried with it this pressure to perform. And that's
Hmm.
received differently by different people for sure. But Christmas, and I'm just kind of reminded, Christmas does become a time where our eyes kind of are forced into the contradiction of like Christmas spirit and the world and the chaos that
Yeah.
doesn't stop. Um, like
Hmm.
like the world doesn't stop being the world. Violence doesn't stop, and you look at places, corners, pockets from Gaza, Israel, Myanmar, like all of these places where Ukraine, where Christmas is not, it may be celebrated, but the contradiction of violence and peace is heightened, intensified. And it actually reminded me. 1968 was probably one of the most formative years, violent years. There was Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and NASA decided to send Apollo 8 for the first manned orbit around the moon. And it was the first time that they sent back pictures. It was the first time humanity had ever seen an Earthrise on the moon, like all just these incredible pictures. And the astronauts read scripture, and it became this very profound moment, like sitting. You can go and listen to it, but here, this is the space program. This is the hallmark of like the high watermark of what we might call modernity, and modernity has its victims too, right? So, in all this efficiency that sent America to the moon was also being turned against Vietnam, and so there's a massive contradiction. And right in the middle of that contradiction are these human beings reading scripture and beaming that back to a planet and a people that they could see and cover with their own thumb, from their spaceship. And so there's a whole host of contradictions. And I think I tell that story I think for me, because it encapsulates, we need to have this conversation, and we need to have it every year. It's vital, because without it, we are converted into all of these refracted, fragmentary things that our narration, the church's narration, can help provide coherence. If the church names the contradiction of peace on earth, goodwill to men with violence, then the church is taking its proper stand to highlight the fact that, and Fleming Rutledge would say, like, we live in between two advents. We live in between the first and the second. And so naming that contradiction, naming that tension, I think is that first act of resistance, of not getting caught up in the sentimentality, but realizing like Christmas is gritty. And you know who did a really good job of recognizing that was Dickens. I just just read the Christmas Carol and tell me I'm wrong, and then go read Luke 2. That's a great place to start. Christmas makes a lot of sense the way we celebrate it when you read Dickens. I think that story has baked its way in.
Yeah, no doubt. I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance for us. We can watch a movie version of A Christmas Carol, or we can watch a Charlie Brown Christmas, where he's asking over and over again, "What's the meaning of Christmas? What's the meaning of Christmas? What's the meaning of Christmas?" And people tell him gifts, and he says, "I was afraid of that." And by the end, you have the Luke 2 reading. Or you can watch The Grinch, where it came without ribbons, it came without tags, it came without packages, boxes, and bags. The whole point of that story is Christmas is not about the things. But as we're watching these movies, there'll be a commercial break that's like, "Come in for your holiday doorbuster special," right? And it's the cognitive dissonance of like, they're putting on these movies and these stories that are shaping us to believe Christmas is about the sentimentality and about the joy and about the family and about being together and about and in Charlie Brown, it's explicitly about Luke 2, right? It's explicitly about the coming of the Messiah. In Dickens, it's about becoming your redeemed self. It's about a conversion. It's about renewing yourself and becoming brand new. And then the commercial ad breaks in and tells you, no, it's actually about more and more and more and more and more. And so the question, I think, after this conversation, which has been really helpful to me, and I hope it's really helpful to our listeners as well, the question I want to ask is, am I this season, am I the person that Jesus wants me to be during Advent and during Christmas, or am I the person that Amazon and Target and Walmart want me to be? Because I think Amazon and Target and Walmart and all of those corporations are really, really good at telling stories that shape us even more powerfully than Dickens and the Grinch and Peanuts, right? And so we're incredibly formed by the imagination that's painted for us by advertisements.
And I think that's the we are bound by these stories. We and if we can't narrate these stories, if we can't if we assume them, or if they kind of travel, there's no kind of getting out of that situation. And that's why I think like the posture of developing it for our own selves and what it looks like can be incredibly creative and unique and different for each individual. But really sitting in that discriminatory I mean that in a positive sense, like the discrimination between Advent and Christmas. There's continuity, there's a connection. Advent is the waiting and the longing that gives Christmas its meaning. And if it's like if we don't take care to participate in that, maybe the contradiction of this whole conversation is that we can articulate a lot of this stuff, and at the end of the day, the nostalgia and the trafficking of that nostalgia, the power of that nostalgia, can still have a very formative effect on Christmas morning. And I don't want to discount that, because if only to maybe alter it slightly to say like that morning, that time is not always joyful for people. Looking around the room and seeing who's not there, looking around the room and seeing who you wish was there. Like these are very heavy things. And being able to say as church community, like there is a space for that kind of Christmas. And that's a very honest Christmas. And so, like I love what you said, like Amazon, all these stories that determine us and bound us and shape us. The first step towards being able to celebrate Christmas is asking ourselves, what is that story? And amidst a flurry of stories that try to shape and direct and coordinate our action, and how can we do that alone? We can't. We have to do that. We get to do that together, and that's powerful. But we get a shot at this every year, God willing. And so
that's right.
There's enough pressure around the season, so it's like, okay, we're approaching halfway through December. What's one thing, what's one thing, what's one posture, what's one practice that your consciousness can handle and wrap around and get a handle on for, okay, this is going to be how I sit in darkness.
Well, Jared, I'm so grateful for you. So incredibly thankful for all of your thoughts and all of your wisdom, and for your flexibility to jump in and help out today.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm thrilled to talk about something else.
I love it. I think it was a really helpful conversation for me as well. And my hope and prayer is that it's helpful to our listeners. So thanks so much, Jared. Well, that does it for 2023. It has been an amazing first year for the Living Room Disciple, and we continue to be blown away by the way you've invited this little podcast into your lives. We are so grateful for you, and we hope and pray that this podcast has been a helpful resource for you as we all journey together towards formation in Jesus' image. I want to thank Jared Stacy for his time and his insights today. And if you want to connect with Jared, you can find his work at jaredstacy.substack.com or connect with him on social media at Jared M. Stacy on Instagram and Threads. As always, we want to thank Anissa Leib for producing the podcast, Eric Church for putting it out into the world, and Daniel Ramirez for composing today's music. You can also support the work that we are doing on Patreon by visiting livingroomdisciple.com. We hope you have a blessed and formative Advent and a Merry Christmas. We'll see you in 2024, and we can't wait to see what God has in store for us on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.